I think it was Richard Pena who once said that when you're, when you're a beginner cinephile, you have to climb up all these different mountains. So you have to climb up Mount Orson Welles or Mount Ozu or, in this case, kind of Mount Antonioni. And after you've done that, you get kind of a wider perspective on this director. The great thing about film history and the great thing about um, a director's career kind of decisively ending either because of retirement or death or any number of factors is that we can look back on the work and see it as kind of um, one colossal thing to be reckoned with. And in this case, Antonioni, there are so many different aspects of his career that help to kind of put individual works into focus. We could look at something like L'Amiche as a standalone piece, or we can look at it as the stepping stones towards the L'Avventuras, La Nottes, and blow-ups. One thing that it has in common with all of those films is that it's kind of populated by deeply unhappy people. Kind of follows into Antonioni's cynical worldview, that we're all kind of loners in lost in space, literally the type of space that Antonioni presents in his films can be really affecting in a way, it provokes some serious angst in the viewer. L'Amiche is adapted from a novella by Cesare Pavese um, called Among Women Only. And Pavese was praised for his kind of restrained look at contemporary Italian society. Kind of his sensibility was much closer to, let's say, the 60s Antonioni than to the 50s Antonioni. So by Pavese's standards, Antonioni was rather on the melodramatic side, and the film was criticized as not being kind of loyal to Pavese's sensibility. Nevertheless, you could see the direction that Antonioni was going in. Interestingly, there are not a lot of adaptations in Antonioni's work. I believe Blow Up was adapted from Julio Cortázar short story, but usually kind of derived his films from other places, other inspirations. So the I don't know if the literary quality of L'Amiche is necessarily its most interesting aspect. Certainly, what's interesting is that it places Antonioni historically and culturally in a certain time and place in Italy, who was kind of being filtered, through his cinema. What authors, what important literary figures. You could see that he was part of already a very kind of fierce intellectual community. He was already kind of taking part in that, even while he was just still kind of a director, within the Italian film industry without much of a name, without much of an international stature. Within Italy, he was already pretty well respected and pretty well known, but it really took something like L'Avventura to launch him into a whole new phase of his career. What makes it interesting is kind of, and this is something that people like Andrew Saris and Jonas Mekas came out and said in defense of the film when it bombed in 1963 when it was released in New York. Released originally, it was actually recently re-released, and it was much more successful than it was in 1963 when people had already seen things like L'Avventura and were expecting those types of forays for Antonioni, not so much L'Amiche. L'Amiche was more subtle. The movements were a bit more spare. Antonioni hadn't really figured out in full force how to convey that feeling of alienation to the audience. You could say even that it wasn't as heavy-handed as it would become in the later films. Antonioni was still really interested in characters and moving the story along using things conventional tools like dialogue. And so there's a lot of dialogue in this film, a lot of wall-to-wall talking scenes, characters moving around, multiple characters moving around in space, often sustained in long shots, long takes. And what's interesting is that it harkens back to sort of classical mode of filmmaking, and looks forward to the modernism of '60s Antonioni. So there's a tension between the two, and there's careful or playful skirting around the norms, of filmmaking of the era. It's Antonioni sort of testing where he could go, and really, it is kind of a stepping stone towards things like L'Avventura. The interesting paradox about studio filmmaking, narrative-driven studio filmmaking from any era and any context in any country, is that we're supposed to kind of believe what the characters are saying. They're kind of orating from the script, and any insight into their minds or any kind of sense of depth in the characters are supposed to kind of emerge from what they say. And this is a very theatrical idea, or a very theatrical conceit, and it doesn't lend a lot to the idea of interesting framing and lighting and so forth. The characters really seem motivated by the conversations that they're having and everything, and the audience is supposed to believe their motivations through the dialogue. They're supposed to believe kind of what's going on is largely expressed through this verbiage, and really that's not what's happening in L'Amiche. There's a lot that's happening with space in this film. The camera kind of moving around very very subtly. Compositions which include a lot of kind of these urban facades, and these social gatherings, these cocktail parties, fashion shows. These are sort of backdrops that Antonioni obviously he feels very comfortable in. It gives him a lot of space to maneuver and to sort of feel out his characters, but really bring out the depth in them, using the space and using camera movement, not so much from the dialogue. So it's interesting that element is present here in L'Amiche, and in the early films in general, but it's losing its importance, and that the shift in emphasis is really happening, and we really see other elements here at play. And these are the sort of elements that really called out critics like Jonas Mekas and Andrew Sarris. He really saw this. They really saw that Antonioni was already going in a different direction in 1955.